Ecuador's Pacific Region, podcast number 11, Cranbrook. The Canadian Rockies International Aerodrome is located 5 nautical miles north of the city of Cranbrook in the East Kootenay region of southern British Columbia. Runway 1634 is asphalt, 8,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. Runway 34 is right-hand circuits, except for glider activity, which is left-hand circuits, runway 34, and right-hand circuits, runway 16. In this episode, we discuss 3 CDORS reports occurring at Cranbrook. I'm Brad Crockett. Joining me is Steve Morley, a flight instructor based on Vancouver Island. Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks for having me again, Brad.
Why do gliders fly opposite-hand circuits at Cranbrook?
A glider has a very different circuit profile and speeds associated with them. By moving their circuits to the opposite side of the runway from regular or powered aircraft, the number of conflicts would be reduced. Further, gliders will typically use a grass landing strip instead of the paved runway, and I would guess that there may be a reasonable stretch of grass available to the west of the runway that they would probably use for their operations.
Our first report is CDORS number 2008 P0054. NAV Canada and the Transportation Safety Board report that on January 13, 2008, at 2141 Zulu, the Cessna 172 registration Golf Hotel Foxtrot Golf took off from Cranbrook for a VFR flight to Lethbridge. Soon after takeoff, the pilot noticed that the aircraft had a tendency to roll. He looked out at the right wing trailing edge and noticed that the right aileron was binding against the right wing flap section. He selected flap down until the aileron was freed. He then raised the flaps. He declared a pan and returned to Cranbrook, where the aircraft landed without further event. That's the end of the report. Steve, a problem with a flight control surface while airborne is pretty rare, isn't it?
Rare indeed. This is one of the few that I've ever read about over the years. In fact, I can probably count on just one hand the number of instances that I can verify were real in over 27 years of flying. I've never personally experienced a flight surface failure of any sort during that time.
Pre-flight inspections and pre-takeoff checks include checking the flight surfaces and controls. Would this problem have shown up in these checks?
I would like to think so, yes, and I have to assume that those pre-flight inspections took place, so we must consider that as an airplane takes flight, the whole structure, wings included, will flex and shift around slightly. So it's possible that a problem may not have been evident during the non-flight activities and presented itself once flight loads had been experienced. I would like to add that it sounds like this pilot did a terrific job of troubleshooting the issue and made the correct decision to land as soon as possible for further investigation. The only thing I might have done differently would have been to leave the flaps down to ensure no further binding once they were retracted. Landing with a stuck aileron wouldn't be too much fun.
Our second report is CDORS number 2012 P2082. On December 27, 2012, at 1900 Zulu, 2 snow removal vehicles became stuck 10 feet from the runway 16 edge on the west side near the north windsock. The pilot of Georgian 7217, a Beech 1900, registration Golf Oscar Romeo Charlie, IFR, requested to land long to avoid any possible contact with the vehicles. The Beech landed safely, and that's the end of the report. Would the pilot have had to transition from an instrument approach to a visual approach at altitude to make this landing work?
Well, we're not sure which approach the Beech was on. I show 3 these days for runway 16. But with proper notification of the issue, the pilot certainly had ceilings and visibility to make a smooth transition to the visual final approach. I suspect they treated the runway as if it had a displace threshold, holding off the final descent until that descent profile brought them down after the vehicles were located.
If the airport had been in instrument meteorological conditions, would flight services have had to close the runway?
I can honestly say that I just don't know what the protocols are specifically for a case like this. I've certainly been into airports where the hold short line is less than 200 feet back from the runway, and with everyone aware of the traffic, or vehicles, Being close by, the arriving pilots are able to determine for themselves whether or not to accept the risk of a vehicle near the runway.
So if the aerodrome environment is contaminated, we can still accept the runway?
Yes, that's correct, Brad. We're still the pilot in command, and just like during every landing, we have to evaluate the risks based on the information provided and decide whether or not to land. I would not like to actually arrive over top of a vehicle below me, but if it was like presented in this incident, where the 150-foot wide runway had a vehicle or two a further 10 feet back, and I was assured no pedestrians were around to wander closer to the runway, I would probably accept the runway and elect to land long just like these pilots did.
Our final report is CDORS number 2014 P1216. On August 1st, 2014, Pasco 360, a Beech 1900C, registration Foxtrot Papa Charlie X-ray, departing to Vancouver, rejected takeoff to avoid a bird strike at 1410 Zulu. The aircraft missed the bird and taxied down to the end of runway 16, turned around, and departed runway 34 safely at 1412 Zulu. That's the end of the report. Steve, rejecting a takeoff roll to avoid a bird strike is not something I remember from flight training specifically. Have you been in this situation?
I've never had to abort a takeoff due to bird activities, though I have experienced a bird strike not too long ago. That being said, I've had my fair share of aborted takeoffs due to potential runway incursions. In fact, a student I had to abort 2 takeoffs just last week. The first one was due to a frozen main wheel brake, and 2 days later due to a family of deer crossing the midpoint of the runway. Pilots always need to be prepared to abort and know just where that point on the takeoff roll can be. All my students get into the habit of a pre-takeoff briefing where they remind themselves of their takeoff speeds, safe abort point, and various other details that could come into play during this very critical phase of flight.
CDORS lists 5 more bird-related occurrences at Cranbrook, all of them strikes, just during the rest of August 2014. Why are they so common there?
We live and fly here in British Columbia, and compared to many other locations, our wildlife numbers can be staggeringly high. Cranbrook is in a wooded area, and the Canada Flight Supplement shows trees close enough by that I would not at all be surprised at bird-related issues such as this. Many of the larger airports have now implemented propane cannons that periodically fire to scare away the local wildlife.
That's it for this episode. Subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, TuneIn Radio, or Google Play Music. You can reach the podcast by email at podcast@cadors.ca. Steve, how can people reach you?
The best way is by email, which is steve@visions-fs.com.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Brad.
And thank you for listening as we exercise our license to learn. Please note that, for the most part, Transport Canada CDORS reports contain preliminary, unconfirmed data which can be subject to change. This podcast is provided by cadors.ca, not by Transport Canada or any other government agency.